I'm David Adelsheim. I am the founder and one of the owners and president of Adelsheim Vineyard in Newburgh. Would you like more than that?
That's good. I think we could be here a long time if we took a lot more than that. Why don't you talk about sort of the early years that led to the founding of IPNC? What was going on that led to you guys deciding to start IPNC?
So in the mid-'80s, the wine industry was certainly starting to feel like it was more than just people sitting together and trying to solve the immediate problems of growing grapes and making wine. There was actually a number of attempts at marketing, if you will. And since I was not actually on the inner part of the original founding of the IPNC, I don't know exactly what brought that group together, but it clearly was out of a need to expand the reach, if you will, of Oregon's wine industry and to expand its importance. I think there was probably not a lot of clarity about how to best do that. And so I think that's one of the reasons that some of the original ideas were a competition and some other things before they settled on the event that it actually became.
Mm-hmm. So were you part of the discussions about this notion of the competition versus the celebration?
Yeah, I certainly, and it's foggy, I've got to admit, but I remember Bob McRitchie was the winemaker for Sokol Blosser, seemed to be part of some of these conversations that were probably taking place around Nick's. But I think I was perceived as the person with the French connection, if you will. Since I'd worked in Burgundy and I had a lot of Burgundian winemaker friends, I think or Bob came to me maybe on behalf of the group and asked about this idea of a competition and how many wineries from Burgundy would want to participate. And I said 0, that nobody would have an interest in a competition. Why don't we do something that's more fun? And I certainly wouldn't want to say that I'm at all responsible for the idea of celebration, but it was certainly a direction I was thinking about at the time. And it ultimately became the direction that was followed. But I would think that others who were intimately involved in those conversations at Nick's probably have an idea of how it ended up as a celebration instead of competition or any of the other things that it could have become.
So why don't you talk about those connections? How had you established the connections with that region of Burgundy?
I worked in Burgundy in 1974. I had wanted to, before we had wine of our own, I wanted to make wine in Burgundy, and I had ended up talking to an exchange, I had ended up talking to a guy who was in the French Ministry of Agriculture, not in Burgundy, and asked him how I might get a harvest job, in essence, in Burgundy. And he worked like crazy trying to figure that out, and nobody wanted an American because the only Americans they'd had back in those days had kind of come in and picked grapes for a couple of days and flaked out and left. And I said, well, I really don't want a job picking grapes. I want to be in a winery and really have a lot to do with it. And ultimately, he thought of the Lycée Agricole Viticole, which is the kind of the, if you will, the high school and junior college level courses for Burgundians whose family members are kind of going to go into the industry, but they don't want a university degree. And it was great because it basically made me one of 3 permanent, for the 3 months, permanent staff members in this winery. But the thing that was most amazing about it was that there was another exchange program going on with the University of Montana, and the kids in this program all had been farmed out to winemakers in Burgundy. Aubert de Villaine had a kid, and I mean, everybody had, all these important winemakers had these Americans as part of their sort of helping of the lycée. So I was taken home by all of them and introduced to these people, and I mean, they've remained people that I can call and contact to this day. So when it came to the IPNC, I guess people thought that somehow I had this ability to bring these people to America. It wasn't all that easy, but I think that's one of the reasons that I was involved at the early stages.
Mm-hmm. So why would, when they come to you and ask you about coming over for our competition, why is it that the competition, when you say, why is it that you say 0 are going to be interested in coming for a competition?
I think I was pretty clear that there was a way that we needed to relate to Burgundians to get them to come to Oregon. And that would be a bit treating them as stars, and a competition in which they were being treated at best as equals wasn't going to work. We needed to play up their specialness and the special place that Burgundy was in the world. And you couldn't do that in a competition where there was a chance that somebody could come in last, or not come in first even.
So talk about the international element. You know, we've got that notion of the celebration. Why is the international component so important?
Important today is one thing. I think important then is maybe what we should first talk about, and that is that I think in 1985 and 86, when this was being discussed, I don't think we felt that if we had an Oregon wine, fill in the blank, celebration, whatever, that anybody would have come, except maybe your best friend down the street or something. And that may have been a little more negative than we needed to have been. It might have been a bigger thing, but to immediately bring in Californians, but also Burgundians and eventually people from all over the world that made Pinot Noir, made a very different statement about what the event was on the one side, but in a sense about who Oregonians were. That we would be perfectly happy to have people from all these different places being part of our event. Made us seem magnanimous, I guess, on the one hand, and international in vision on the other hand. And it gave us a level of sophistication just by putting the word international and being international that we would never have had if it had been an Oregon wine event. Today, sure, if we were starting today, we could do an Oregon wine event and there'd be sellout crowds coming. But for the 1987 beginning, probably couldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm. So Jason Lutt talks about, for him, that's a huge component now, today, is to make sure that that international piece remains in there as part of the celebration.
And I certainly agree with that. I would, even if we could change the event today to something else, I think there's not only a history of having done this, but also set the example for the world. I'm sure there were other international things that had taken place before, but as best I know, there's been nothing like the IPNC in terms of starting international, continuing every year, bringing in people from all over the world every year, and in essence, being self-effacing about the Oregonianness of this event. And it would be a very different event without the international piece of it. It might be a perfectly fine event, but it would be a very different event. And I think we would lose some of the essence of what the IPNC has brought to Oregon if it wasn't international.
Could you talk a little bit about the place that IPNC holds in Oregon wine history? Last year we did the interviews with you all about sort of that early period, and here now you're far more established already by the mid '80s. So where does this kind of, what place does IPNC hold?
Well, the history of the Oregon wine industry, particularly in the North Willamette Valley, is a series of things that bump us up a little bit more in terms of credibility and acceptance and ability to sell wine and pricing and all the things that make for an industry. But the founding of the IPNC in the first event, 1987, brought people to Oregon who never would have come before. We finally had given people a reason to come to Oregon wine country. Some of them got no further than McMinnville in those days, but others came early, stayed late. But all of them, I suspect, I've often said this in the past, they came because of the Burgundians and maybe even Californians and others that were part of the show. They left knowing Oregon and being in love with Oregon. And the reason that this was so important and continues to be important today is that it makes a statement about the sophistication and importance of Oregon through this sort of lack of apparent focus on Oregon. And it's very interesting how it's worked. But even by not saying it's an Oregon event, it becomes the Oregon event for consumers. And therefore is probably the most important thing we do in any given year in further establishing credibility, further attracting new customers, and basically building the image of Oregon.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know there have been a couple of folks, Susan Sokol-Blosser being one of them, mentions the fact that the original idea was not necessarily to have this every year here, but there seemed to be something about the Oregon wine community itself, especially in those early years, that wound up making it so that you all could pull this off. And it seems like maybe, I think the offer was possibly, would we go to France, to Burgundy, or would you have the Californians?
Yeah, and I was sort of intimately involved with that because we did the first one in Oregon, and actually I'd talked to the Drouins the year before when Robert and Françoise brought their daughter Veronique to work harvest in Oregon. I talked with Robert about the event and how could he help us ensure that there was a group of Burgundians that came to the event so that it was significant, and they were rather significant in helping bring that original group. The thing that happened immediately after that, as you may know, was in the spring, I think May of '88, Neil Goldschmidt, who was governor at the time, had asked to see if we could put together some sort of an event in Burgundy to kind of reciprocate for all the Burgundians coming to IPNC. So I was kind of the lead on that and put together a tasting at the Chateau de Savigny-le-Bon, and Neil was there, and I think there were 12 Oregon winemakers there and their wines, and it was quite a weird event in a sense. Here we were in a classic chateau in the center of Burgundy, and we were showing Oregon wines, and Louis Latour was coming in and trying these wines, which he probably had never had before, and saying, we have something to worry about here. And the attendees were more or less the who's who of Burgundy. It was quite an amazing event. And we wondered with our friends in Burgundy if we couldn't move the event to Burgundy. And Jacques and Roz Sass, particularly Roz, who's an American from Domaine Dujac, really wondered about this because they'd come to the second IPNC and were really excited about it and really liked not only the internationalism of it, but the possibility to raise appreciation for the wines made from Pinot Noir. And they really thought that it would be great to be able to do it in Burgundy. But after the second IPNC, she admitted that there would actually be no way to do it in Burgundy. That she realized by looking at what it took to pull off the IPNC, the incredible amount of time that it took to organize it, to get all the wineries there, to come up with the money to do that, and ultimately to have all the volunteers that it takes to pull off the event. And maybe the thing that she was not quite as willing to say, but the cooperation of all the wineries to do it, they just couldn't do. And there was a bit of a competition at the time between California and Oregon, and I think many Californians thought that somehow the IPNC was kind of trying to take the limelight away from California. And there was Pinot Noir America was an organization that was founded right about the same time and was principally Californian in its focus, and not many Oregonians joined that group, and it was simply to do marketing events. But so there was a little bit of a clash between the two states even back then. We wanted to work together, and really IPNC in the early years, equal numbers of California and Oregon producers in it. It was not as much more Oregon-centric as it is today. But even so, there was no real push to take the event to California. In fact, early on, there was interest in the southern Central Coast, where Waupun takes place today. That was envisioned early on by them, and they basically held off. More or less out of respect for what we were doing, that they didn't want to take away from our focus. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it was probably 10 years or so of IPNC before they started their event. Mm-hmm. And it clearly was modeled on IPNC, just like the New Zealand event is modeled on IPNC and others around the world.
You mentioned the volunteers who come in and sort of, the Burgundians wondering if they'd be able to pull that off. Can you talk about what it's like to have, you've got an event at Linfield, which is a Baptist college, and you've got drawing volunteers from McMinnville and all the way up into Portland, and I think our current director comes from Seattle. What's it like to have these volunteers and this kind of community come together?
As a winery, we have this one focus from over here that is about all these people, that most of whom we know, that make wine, and those that we don't know, whose wines we want to try. And we're sort of caught up in we're almost like a guest at our own event. And it's, you really have to step back from the moment of the event and realize what is going on to make this event possible. And it's mostly about people. I mean, there's some theories and thoughts and organization and all that, but it's mostly about the people that make the food happen, the people that make the wine happen, and the people that just make the event continue on and on and on. And it's, I mean, it obviously starts with a board of directors, well, a director and a board of directors and some staff people, but it literally would not be an event without volunteers. There is no way to hire the staff of people that serve all the food. There's no way to hire all the people that pour all the wines, organize all the wines, that do all the setup of the salmon bake, for instance. It's just an incredible array of people. And if if the people coming to the event had to pay employees somehow, temps, to do all this work, the cost of the ticket would be 4 or 5 times what it is, and nobody would come. So it's an amazing devotion on the part of the volunteers, and for some of them, it's actually an amazing opportunity to be part of a world that they are not part of the rest of the year. People that work in a kitchen together with professional chefs, and the rest of the year they cook dinner at home, but that's the closest they get to that. People that assemble huge quantities of wines and make sure that they're poured and all this. The rest of the year, they work as a realtor, or they have some other job that has nothing to do with this. This is as close as they get to being part of this professional world of, in this case, wine, but it could be food, it could be events organization. And I think they're thrilled to be part of it, and I don't mean that at all patronizingly. I think it's a chance to be in a different universe for a brief period, know that you get to go back to your regular life and do what you do normally the rest of the year. But I believe these people that have come back, well, you said 22 years for one couple that have worked in a kitchen. Worked in the kitchen. That's incredible, and they must not just enjoy it, but see it as a real high point in their year that they plan around.
What about you personally, in terms of your participation in IPNC? It seems like there are a lot of ideas that are exchanged, that there are a lot of relationships that are developed, and it seems like you obviously came into IPNC because they sort of tapped into your relationships prior to it. But over the years, what are some of the things that have affected you personally as a result of IPNC?
I think the things that have affected me most have been sort of the general thing that you were saying about either making new relationships or cementing old ones. But it's also led to weird new ideas that somebody brings up. The guys from Poggier Sandri in Alto Adige came, I don't know, it was probably 7 or 8 years ago, and we were having some sort of a conversation because they only speak, I think one of them speaks German. So I think we were carrying on this conversation in German about how he had converted a press to make white wine where there was no contact between the wine and oxygen through the entire winemaking process from grapes to bottle. And it's an intriguing approach, a very reductive winemaking approach that could be very interesting. It's sort of the opposite that a lot of people in the New World have gone to, and I'm still trying to get back to Alto Adige and spend some time with him to see exactly what he is doing. But that's the kind of a thing that comes up in a conversation at IPNC, more or less out of the blue, where, and in fact these guys make Pinot Noir, but really their focus is white wine. And so it's bizarre that it would happen at IPNC, which is supposed to be focused on Pinot. And I'm sure I could, with enough regurgitation of my head, come up with one of those or two of those or three of those from virtually every year, because I think it's the incidental conversation that actually makes these events so important for, I bet, every winery that's participating. I guess the other thing that IPNC gets me thinking about each year is how we do and should work together in the world to promote the wines that we make from this common grape. And I don't remember, well, I remember a lot about how Oregon Pinot Camp was founded, and it could not have been founded if it had not been for IPNC. we needed to figure out how to reach the trade, particularly the frontline trade that was not going to be able to come up with the ticket price for IPNC. And so we were trying to understand what you would need to do to bring the trade in, and just the whole range of things. But it was all in reference to IPNC, because any event that you did in Oregon had to be in reference to IPNC. That was the thing that showed how you did a successful event. And one of the things that we took early on for OPC was this needs a very separate and focused audience, so that it doesn't take away from IPNC, but reaches people that are never going to come to IPNC. And so developing ideas about how to reach the world is what I find myself thinking about each year when it's IPNC time, as a result of seeing all these people that are engaged in sort of parallel pursuits to me.
Do you have any memorable IPNC stories? We've had quite a few stories from the volunteers and the directors and baguette shortages and all kinds of things. Do you have any?
Baguette shortages, I forgot about that. And what about the case of Burgundian wine, really expensive Burgundian wine that was stolen one year or vanished one year? That was kind of a sad story. I certainly have lots of fun stuff that has happened. I think, I mean, my significant other and I got together because of IPNC, if you will, a couple of different times over the years where we just hung out together and realized that we really needed to do something more permanent with each other. And it was really because of IPNC that brought her. She was involved. She was the president of the California winery. But I think I don't know that I've got a specific story that I'm thinking about this moment. The thing that for me is the most fun in some respects is that you're sitting at the salmon bake or wandering around at the salmon bake, and here at one table are 4 winemakers from Burgundy and their families or whomever, and other people hovering around. And these are people that if you wanted to go visit them, it would be a huge deal, not only in terms of money, but planning and just all the contact work. And you could just, here you are at the IPNC, and just hang out with them and just wander over and show them some wine, taste some wine, talk about what's going on. To me, it's, and I don't know from a consumer standpoint, because I can't be a consumer at IPNC, but from a winery standpoint, it's just a wonderfully natural way to hang out with your colleagues and see the world through their eyes in a way that you wouldn't otherwise get to do.